I just wanted to start with a brief introduction before we move to Abul Fazl's talk about what the technical review is and why we are writing it. When we first took on the endeavor to update the 2008 roadmap, one of the first things we did was review criticism of that roadmap, and we tried to address it in our publication. One of these major criticisms was that it was more of a technical review rather than a roadmap. So we decided as a first step to updating the roadmap, we should do a technical review. So this technical review will cover topics like neurotechnology, artificial intelligence, brain mapping, artificial substrates, computational brain models, and brain theories. We actually could use someone to help us write the artificial intelligence section, so let me know if you're interested. But our goal with this technical review is to present an unbiased overview of these topics and the relationship with whole brain emulation. And this will be distinct from what we intend to do with the roadmap, where we'll want to detail short and long-term goals, key problems and uncertainties, and that would require a bit more opinion. So with these presentations, each of our writers will be presenting an overview of what they will cover in their respective sections. These presentations will be relatively short to allow for plenty of Q&A time. We're hoping to get a lot of your input on what we should be writing about. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Abul Fazl Al-Abor, who will be leading our effort on the artificial brain section. Abul Fazl received his pharmacy doctorate from Shiraz University of Medical Sciences in Iran and is currently a graduate student in the Newman Memory Lab at Indiana University, where he studies neural coding and information transfer mechanisms in the hippocampus and related structures.
Okay, do you guys have my voice right now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, nice. Okay. I would like to first thank Alicia for the introduction, and thank you guys for joining us.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, nice. Okay. And also, thank you guys for joining us for this part of the technical review presentation. And in this part, I'm going to talk about hardware implementations for brain emulation, and we'll shortly discuss the theoretical considerations for such purpose, and then we'll review some current status of the this technology, and then in a few minutes we talk about the future directions. So let's first start with the question: what is brain emulation, and what's the difference between brain emulation and a brain stimulation? So let's imagine that we have a system called System A, and we give the system an input, and we give a system an input, and system processes that input and gives us an output as a result. And then we want to simulate the system. We give the system the simulation the same input, and we expect the simulation to generate a fairly similar output for us with a little bit of tolerance for error. And but in an emulation, we would like the system to process the same input and give us the same output, and map the same input-output relationship, and also considers the internal dynamics of a system. But there's a question in here, and the question is that how much of detail and how much resolution do we need in that internal dynamics? Do we need to recreate the system down to the level of atoms and molecules in that system? Or in case of the brain, do we need to replicate all the neurons and all the dendrites and dendritic spines, or we need to use the circle level analysis, or maybe a systems level replication of the internal dynamics? This is a question that we need to take into account and consider when we want to address this issue. And a second theoretical consideration that I would like to first talk about in here is the enormous computational demands of a whole brain emulation. Let's imagine that we want to emulate the cerebral cortex and not the entire brain, just the cerebral cortex, 17 billion neurons at the neuronal level. As most of you know, if we increase the biological realism of a model, the model becomes computationally expensive. And if we decrease the cost, excuse me, if we decrease the computational cost, we'll have a model that is not biologically realistic. But there's been a solution to this called the simple model proposed by Ishkevich at 2003, excuse me, and in which you can see that equation down there is a simple equation. There's two dynamical equations coupled together, and it can show a rich repertoire of different dynamics in neurons. And this is the most probably one of the most probable models that we have about neurons. So let's imagine that we want to use this neuron and this model, and this model needs 13,000 operations per second to simulate the neuron at the real time. Let's imagine that we're using this model and we have just 17 billion neurons, which equals almost to the number of neurons that we have in cerebral cortex. And we want to run a simulation. If we want to do so, we need, and if we consider that each neuron has 10,000 synaptic connections, at the end of the day, we will need something like 2.2 exaflops for just simulating the cerebral cortex. And if we consider the neurons that we have in the cerebellum with the same number of connections, we will need 11 exaflops, which means we will need 11 multiplied by 10 to the 18 operations per second. So look at this graph for a better understanding and graphical representation of what we're dealing with right now. So here's the brain. We have something on the order of 11 exaflops and the power consumption of 20 watts. And here's the best supercomputer as of November 2017. So this supercomputer located in China uses 15 megawatts, but it has a computational power of 93 petaflops, which is 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the computational power that we need to simulate the brain. And in terms of power, we'll see there's a significant difference between these two systems. Well, I'm talking about this topic, having this point in mind that it's still debated whether brains are computers or not. So 2 main points that I wanted to talk about in the theoretical section was that excuse me, first, there's a difference between emulation and simulation, and depending on how much, depending on our level of abstraction, we would want to design different hardwares. And we need highly power efficient and highly powerful systems to perform the whole brain emulation. These are the 2 main theoretical considerations that we have to take into account for the whole brain emulation. And let's talk about some partial emulation of neural systems. So previously we talked about this idea that the brain needs an enormous amount of computation, and it's so much power efficient. And this is not what we have in our general purpose supercomputers. So is there a solution for this? People in the field of neuromorphic engineering and people who have been thinking about this problem came up with this idea that instead of using general purpose CPUs, let's make hardwares that can only perform the neural simulation or neural computation, and then that can probably solve the problem or address the problem in a way. So let's talk about one of the good examples of this effort, the NeuroGrid. NeuroGrid, developed by Carboncopies at Stanford University, is a neuromorphic chip that can simulate neurons, almost 1 million neurons with 1 billion synapses in real time, and it's 100,000 times faster than a Blue Gene supercomputer, and it only consumes 5 watts of power. As you can see in the picture, There are 16 neural cores that each of them have 65,000 neurons. And this model had been applied to modeling retina. And another point that is worth considering about this model is that there's a trade-off between the neuronal detail and the number of neurons that we have. For example, for example, if we want to have 1 million neurons, we can have 1 million simple neurons with just one equation and one compartment each, which means we're thinking about neurons as if they're just membrane patches. And or we can have 100,000 neurons, and each neuron can have 10 compartments, and we can consider the morphology and dendrites of a neuron. But it comes with the cost of losing the number of neurons that we are doing the simulation of. So this is a graphical representation of the neural grid, but although it's not complete, but it gives us an idea of where this neuromorphic system plays. So upon our previous discussion about the power consumption, so if we have this supercomputer in here and also the brain in here, neural grid lands somewhere around here. Let's imagine, because neural grid uses 5 watts of power to simulate 1 million neurons. So if we want to simulate 1 billion neurons or 86 billion neurons, it's probably need an order of tens of kilowatts of power to run the entire simulation. While we have seen that we need to use 15 megawatts of power for the simulation on a general purpose CPU and supercomputer. On the other hand, if we compare the number of neurons and number of synapses that we have, so in the brain we have 86 billion neurons, 150 trillion synapses, and in the neural grid, what we have achieved is something around 1 million neurons and 1 billion synapses. But note that the axes are not a scale. It's just a conceptual comparison between two systems. So let's go to the Europe, where people are developing neuromorphic hardware by support of the Human Brain Project. So this project called Brain Skills are mostly people from Heidelberg, Germany are participating in that project, but it's supported by the Human Brain Project. And in 2012, there's been development of a wafer, final steps, and it was ready. And in that wafer that contains 196,000 neurons with 50 million synapses in total had been implemented on that wafer. And the thing that that is true about, and it's good about this wafer, is that it's programmable, and the programmer can change the neural detail as just like the neural grid neuromorphic hardware. And it's also compatible with Pine, which is a simulator-independent language that, regardless of the environment that the programmer wants, it can use it for program different systems. We talk about the Pine more in the upcoming slides. And this system has been mostly used for neural simulations. Here is the Brain Skills machine, which contains 20 wafers, and that's 4 million neurons and 1 billion synapses in this single machine. So for comparison, you can look at the graph at the right side. Again, a comparison between the brain and this system, number of neurons, and also the number of synapses on the vertical axis. It's pretty. It can be considered a smaller system compared to the other neuromorphic systems, such as the Spinnaker. So the Spinnaker system, developed by Steve Ferber, the person who had been heavily involved in development of ARM processors, and you can see a prototype of the chips, the boards that are being used in the system up here. It contains, it's a 48-node system in this picture, that it has 868 cores and 1,000 neurons in each core. And upon building of the final Spinnaker machine, which is a collection of these boards, we'll have 1 billion neurons and 1 trillion synapses, which is a major step towards better emulation machines. And this machine have been.
I just want to interrupt you for a second. Yeah. You have 2 to 5 more minutes, and we'll move to the Q&A.
Okay. All right. So this machine had been used for building line follower robots and information representation. And this is a machine with 500,000 cores. And this is visual comparison. And this is another project called True North chips under the Synapse project. Each of the yellow chips that you're seeing here is a True North chip, and this board that had been shown in here contains 60 million neurons and 4 billion synapses. But the limitation on this chip is that the programmer can only use integrated and fire neurons, and while you could in a Spinnaker system you could use you could program your neuron or use HW neurons or integrated and fire neurons. More than any other neuromorphic system that we talked about, this system had been designed for applications, and it had shown good results in power-efficient real-time object recognition. So I'll skip talking about Human Brain Project and also the SPAN, but it's worth talking about the SPAN model because it gets back to the neuromorphic design systems. The SPAN model is the largest behaving model of the human brain, and it contains around 2 million neurons with 800 million synapses, and it can perform 8 different vision motor tasks. So in the future directions, NeuroGrid and also the Spinnaker project, they are developing and implementing the SPAN project on the neuromorphic chips. And but something that we couldn't possibly cover in this topic in this short time was the commercial projects and also implementation of neural networks on FPGAs. For example, there's been development in FPGA implementation of neural circuits and neural networks FPGAs using the same program that I've talked about, Pine. And so reaching to the summary and conclusion, we talked about theoretical considerations, the enormous computational demands of whole brain emulation, and also the difference between emulation and simulation. We also talked about the current status. We reviewed different neuromorphic hardware project, and also we talked about the SPAN and a little bit about the future directions and the references. And thanks for listening to this talk, and I'm ready for hearing your questions.
Great, thanks, Abulfaz. So looking at the online Q&A, looks like we might have some new ones. Do we have anyone in the live audience that has any questions while I flip through this? Yeah, I don't think we have any new questions on the Q&A link. But Keith is asking if you could comment or speculate on how to reach human brain efficiency.
Well, to reach human brain efficiency, that's a real good question, but the most important step that people have taken so far is to try to build these application-specific hardwares and also type of designs that the circuit usually comes online and works when it's needed, not all the time. The same thing that happens in the brain. So neurons start firing when we need them to fire, not all the time just firing and being in a standby mode, but firing at the same time. They're just silent, and when they're needed, they become active. And this is something that has been used in some neuromorphic designs too. Yeah. But I think Randall might have some input on this. I don't know. Yeah. But I think Randall might have some.
Yeah. Yes, there are, I think, some questions here in the house. I certainly have questions myself as well. So let me go and ask that question, and then I'll repeat it to you, and you can answer it.
Okay.
So obviously, some of the motivation behind developing these neuromorphic chips is just like long-term brain emulation and study neuroscience. But I'm curious what maybe some of the nearer-term goals are that these companies have in mind for applications.
Okay. So the question from Brian is, obviously, some of the reasons for creating these neuromorphic chips and these companies is to eventually use them for something like brain emulation and for studying in neuroscience, etc. But what are some of the near-term goals? Why these neuromorphic chips are being created? Could you say something to that?
Well, yeah, that's another good question. So back to the slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the commercial neuromorphic chips. And for example, in the short term, we would see some of these chips, and actually they're being used in cell phones for object recognition, fast and efficient and low power object recognition. And I think it might be a driving force for the development of neuromorphic chips in the near future. So Intel had acquired a startup company, and also in UAV industry, they're using neuromorphic chips for different purposes. But what I can say is that efficient and low power object recognition is something that neuromorphic chips are doing really good at, and I think it might be a driving force for the for more development of these type of chips.
I'm unfortunately still not seeing any questions in the online Q&A. Are there any more in-house questions?
Yeah, we still have some in-house questions. And sorry, Alicia and Abul Fazl, that whenever, say, it seems like there is just dead silence and no one is responding to the fact that you stopped talking, it's just because the live stream is between 20 and 30 seconds late, and we're waiting for the live stream to end, and then I get back to you. So, it doesn't mean that everything's over and nobody's talking. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what Keith Wiley is trying to do there, and maybe that's going to be useful right away. But first, let me ask a question that I had, and then we'll see also if there are some more questions here in house. Maybe I missed something that you presented because I was spending a little bit of time talking to Ted Berger in the kitchen area here. But maybe not. When I first saw the beginning part of your presentation, I noted that you were giving some examples of models of neurons and how they work and their implementation and how they could be used to replicate, say, spiking in an emulated brain. I'm just wondering if you could talk to the difference between, say, trying to use a model for a neuron, say a spiking neuron, that you have a model that you could put into a neuromorphic chip, and trying to match that to, say, the structure or circuit structure of a piece of brain tissue, and then trying to make sure that this is producing the same kind of output, versus take, for example, what Ted was presenting earlier, the situation where you are building up functions that are based on what you've observed in terms of spiking, and you're trying to model the probability distribution of spikes in a certain area, and then that you'd use those mathematical functions as the kind of thing that you'd want to implement. So there's this difference between directly implementing what you've been modeling based on how you observe the responses of the system versus taking an abstract type of neural activity and trying to match that to what you found in a piece of brain tissue. And again, I might have missed a piece there, so I'm sorry if I'm making you repeat something.
No, I didn't talk about this topic much, but I touched upon the topic of level of abstraction and on what level should we stop? Should we go down to the level of atoms and molecules that constitute the brain, or can we come a little bit higher and work on the neuronal level, or we should go to the circle level, as you said, or we should even go higher and go to system level? And I think that's an open question. We don't know. So it seems that the consensus in neuroscience is that the neurons are the building blocks, and we should build it on at the neuronal level. But I myself, I don't know. And I think it's an open question. It's still an open question. Although, if you just extract the probability distributions and implement them on a hardware, and it works, that we have seen in Ted Berger's publications before in the past couple of years, and it works. But we don't know if it works all the time, or I think there is still so much room for research to find out the exact level of abstraction. I think there is so much room for research to find out the exact level of abstraction.
Yeah, so quick follow-up there. So in terms of structuring your tech review with these uncertainties in mind, how do you go about constraining, or conversely, leaving open enough the range of different implementation possibilities that you would look into if you're going to say, okay, we're talking about how do you best implement a brain emulation? Like, where do you, how broad do you make it? How narrow do you make it?
I think one reasonable opening might be start from the neuronal level, or at least at the synaptic level, and the neuronal morphology, and then in between we have the neuronal level description, and then we have the circuits. But I don't think that we should go beyond circuits into systems. So we shouldn't try to make abstraction, put the level of abstraction at the level of the systems. It seems plausible to do it at the level of the circuits, neurons, and maybe neuronal morphology. These three scales, I think they sound plausible.
Thank you. Let me just check for in-house questions. That possibly covers it right now. Now, before we switch to the next person, which I'm sure Alicia is happy to introduce the next person coming up, which I believe is me because I'm standing in for Ilya. I just wanted to mention that we have a technical issue coming up, which fortunately we've been warned about in advance. It's that in the using this Hangout approach with the live stream, there is apparently an 8-hour cutoff, which we're approaching. So at that point, we need to start again with a new session. That means that the link is probably going to change. And of course, we'll make that link available on the website, and we'll push it through everywhere we can just to make sure everyone knows about it. But I just wanted to let you all know in advance. Once the time is due to make that switch, our admin here, Javon Feinblatt, is going to let me know, and then I'll remind everyone again. But this is just an advance warning. Okay, back to you, Alicia.
So there is actually one question that came up on the Q&A for Abul Faz, if we can go back to that. He was asking, how much computation do you estimate is happening in each neuron?
Well, it's hard to estimate to how much computation is happening in each neuron. So, and there's another question saying, there's this idea saying neurons do not compute, and the brains are not computers. So, but if we want, let's put this question in this way. If we want to simulate a single neuron, how much computation do we need to perform? That might be a better question to try to address. So let's as we discussed before, let's go back to this slide, and let's assume that we're using the Ishkevich neuron, and this Ishkevich neuron needs 13,000 operations per second. And then let's imagine that this neuron, the same neuron that we're going to simulate, receives and sends 10,000 synapses. So it's simplified, it's stupidly simplified, but let's just make the simplification. And let's imagine that each synapses per each millisecond needs just one operation. So if we do a simple math, it will be 13 million computations per second. This is an approximate number that we can think of right now. But still, I don't know if Randall have any opinion on this, or you want to add something, comments on this answer, or this question, actually.
No, I don't really have a particular comment to make because, of course, you know, the kind of computation that's being done, it depends on the abstraction level at which you're looking at the problem, or, you know, what you're going to include and what not and why. So it's too early, I think, to talk about that. We all throw out some big estimates. That's where the exaflops come in, but I think it's actually quite early. So I'll give, once again, giving it back to Alicia.
We have one really popular question on the Q&A asking about how we could speed up the timeline that Ken Hayworth outlined for us earlier. For 2100 is the year for mind uploading. I'm wondering if we can apply that to this discussion here. Abulfaz, do you think that there's anything in neuromorphic technology that is part of why the timeline is so much longer, is so long?
So you're asking if there is anything in the neuromorphic hardware technology that makes it to be a longer time after 2100?
Right. So is there anything in this field that we could do to help speed things up?
Well, yes, we have already seen this in projects like Synapse project, that they have achieved marvelous numbers in terms of the neurons that they have simulated, or the skill that they're performing their simulations. One thing is that if the commercial companies and also the scientific community become more and more involved in this process, I think it might be it will definitely help so that we can have a possible emulation platform sooner than that time. But any forecast and anything, I don't think that it's, as Randall said, it's probably really soon to talk about this. But I think any process, any advancement in the neuromorphic technology will definitely affect that. And but on the other hand, I don't think that the neuromorphic technology would be the bottleneck for this, for the mind uploading process. And so what seems to me is the bottleneck is the way that people want to transfer the information into the emulation software and destination platform. So, but this destination platform is probably not the bottleneck process, the slowest process. That's my standing on this point. The bottleneck process is slowest.
Yeah, I actually have a comment on that. It's really interesting to see how these projections for what year is it going to be that you get a whole brain emulation, how they come about. And also, I found it interesting that Ken said at some point that his projection looked a lot longer than mine. Meanwhile, he had put somewhere in the middle of the 21st century, he had put the first upload, the first emulation of a human brain, which was kind of the same that I put on my slide. But you know, I think there's this effect, and it's kind of related to the Dunning-Kruger sort of thing, where, you know, the less you know about something, the more likely it is you can be very optimistic, and as you know more, you become more pessimistic because you know the real problems that are there. So for example, that's why we'll say things like, okay, it looks right now like the big problem is data acquisition. Once we have data acquisition, the next step's going to be really fast, and you know, emulation hardware is no big deal at all. That's something we'll just, you know, be able to do in a year or two, because why would that be a problem? We haven't really even had to tackle that because we don't know what we're going to try to emulate on a hardware platform. As we get closer to that, then we'll see just how hard that really is. So that's just a comment about how, you know, we make estimates about some things. We'll say like, oh, it's going to take forever to collect all the necessary data for an emulation, because that's the problem we're dealing with right now. Right, okay, so having said that, because throwing out these estimates without taking that into account, and without taking into account that it's not just what can you do and how fast could it be done, but also, is there going to be a project to do that? And is the money going to be available? Is there the will? Those sorts of things are not even scientific or technical. They're just economics and politics and whatever else. I tend to just give other types of answers. Like I'll say something like, I'd be super surprised if this got done in 20 years or less. But then I'll say something like, I'd also be super surprised, or I'd be sad for what must have happened to the Earth in the meantime if we didn't get this done in 100 years. Sort of saying, you know, it looks like the sort of problem that should be doable by this civilization in some time span like that. But then within that, where you peg it, it's going to depend on so many precise factors that it's just not even worth speculating. That's my comment on that anyway. I don't know if there are any more, if anyone wants to say something about that before we move on. No? Okay. Back to you, Alicia.
All right, so we're ready for our next presentation. Ilya is in charge of the neurotechnology section, but unfortunately he's very ill and is unable to join us today. So our very own Randall Kuna is going to be presenting this section for us.
Okay, thanks for handing me the mic again. So as you already mentioned, I'm doing this in Ilya's stead at the moment. And at one point, Ilya thought that he was going to prepare a recorded presentation for us, and that was what we were going to play. So I don't even have that. So instead, I'm just going to take his topic area with the small outline that was there and to try to formulate what it is that he might want to try to capture in doing a tech review of his area, which is basically neurotechnology relevant to brain emulation. So neural prosthesis, neural interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, that area. And I guess, you know, if I were Ilya, one of the first things I'd try to do is I would try to define those terms. So if we're going to be building a neural prosthesis, what is, for example, a satisfactory neural prosthesis? For what kind of goal? We're going all the way up to brain emulation, but there are, of course, a lot of steps below that. Say a patient with a dysfunction is going to be satisfied with something a lot simpler than somebody who is a healthy person and who is thinking, well, should I get my, you know, my hippocampus replaced, or my visual cortex, or my motor cortex, or something like that. And depending on those criteria, you might have to look for very different technology. Also, if I were Ilya, I would try to make very clear the distinction between creating neural interfaces with the brain, so a way to talk to neurons in the brain, a way to just get at data to be able to observe, access, monitor, and even write back, versus the process of creating a replacement. So neural prosthetics, neural prosthesis, the building of devices that can take over the function of an area of the brain as something rather different than a simple neural interface. And when I say simple, I don't mean it's easy, just rather different. So I would definitely focus on that. And then, yeah, then there's the question of what sort of data is most important for both for the access. So what is it you want to see? Do you want to see spikes? Do you want to see membrane potentials? Do you want to be able to probe the neurochemicals that are diffusing through some part of the brain at that point? Do you need to be able to register the level of LTP or LTD that's present somewhere? Does that matter at all? So there are questions about what type of data you're trying to get at with this neurotechnology, what you're trying to see with a neural interface or brain-computer interface. and also what you're trying to reconstruct. What are you trying to build? And then there's this issue of combining different types of data. So the one that we talk about a lot is the problem of combining functional data, so the responses, the activity you see in the brain, with structure, trying to use both of them as sources of information that will allow you to more feasibly create either a good interface or a prosthesis. And by that I mean, you know, either way, whether you're trying to build a prosthesis based on functional recording, or if you're trying to build it based on structural recordings, like connectomics, you're faced with some serious challenges. If you're trying to do this using structural data, you're starting with something that is basically a three-dimensional image or a network of nodes with connections between them. But to get from that to something that's functional, how do you do that? How do you infer function from structure? For that, you need to have a really good understanding of how certain brain areas work, how various components of the brain work, the sorts of probability distributions there are for exactly what they may be expressing at this time, and how you have to sample from those probability distributions to build up your functional models. And all of that is information that you can gain by doing functional recording and by looking at what's going on in the system as it's operating. So the structural approach, which is the one that, for example, the 2008 Oxford workshop talked about most when we produced that roadmap back then, that one is totally undoable at the moment unless you bring in all this extra that wasn't talked about at the time. Conversely, if you're trying to build a neural prosthesis based entirely on functional data, then you have the problem that, of course, first of all, you're usually only looking at a subset of the cells that are really involved. How many do you have to look at? Do you need to see 20%? Do you need to see 80%? Do you need to, is it enough to get by with 1%? To really capture what the function is of that system, of this little piece, this little black box that you're investigating. That's one question, but there's also the question, how long do you have to observe that black box to capture what's going on? Because, you know, naively suspect that the only things you can know about the system are what you've observed. Now, if you're doing good machine learning, you can often extrapolate beyond that. You can build functions that generalize, that predict beyond what you've seen. But how do you know that those predictions are valid, that they're correct? So validating that system is trouble. So just because you can't observe that piece of the brain from birth until the moment where you're trying to build this prosthesis, that's a problem. And even if you could observe it throughout its entire lifespan, you don't know what things you haven't seen that just haven't manifested, but that were there in the blueprint from the beginning. So that's where trying to constrain your functional problem in a variety of ways and making that whole thing, making it computable, making it possible to derive parameters for your models, making it so that you better predict what it should be doing or may be doing. For that, having a lot of information about the underlying circuit structure, getting that structural data is very important. So the two things, these two data sources are very important, and it's important how to combine them. And that's where I would focus on trying to look at not just what are the methods out there that people use to either do functional recording or to do structure mapping, but to think very carefully about, well, how would you use this to combine the information you're getting into something that constrains your problem as much as possible and makes it as validatable as possible. And if you can use those two criteria as a guide for this investigation, as a way to, say, decide what is a really promising approach, what's a less promising approach, or what might need to be added, that's where it gets really interesting, if you can do a tech review with that sort of detail. Now, of course, that's a tall order, and I'm sure this is not going to be done in the first iteration, but that's sort of how I would approach the problem. And that's what I'll leave my version of saying what Ilya might have said at this point, and I'm open for questions.
So unfortunately, it's very quiet still on the online Q&A. Do we have any live questions?
Yeah, we've got a question here in the house. I'll repeat it as soon as I hear it. Daniel asked a fantastic question. He asked, so about the difference between trying to create a prosthetic that actually replicates the underlying neural code of a piece of a system of a neural tissue or neural circuit that you're trying to build a prosthesis for, versus one that merely accomplishes, say, the same or an equivalent functional role, but where the brain has to do some learning, where the plasticity of the brain is being used to actually be able to use the prosthesis. This is a very, very significant question because, of course, most of the work that has happened so far in neural interfaces as well as prosthesis here, the example Daniel asked about was cochlear implants, which of course don't operate at all like the underlying system. And also in interfaces where, say, people say, oh, you just have to stick an electrode anywhere in the brain and the brain can learn how to use it and move an arm, right? Move a robot arm or something. This is true, but I think there's a huge distinction there between the goals, what you're trying to achieve. In some cases, oh, by the way, I'm getting some feedback. Someone else is not muted. I think it might be Javon or someone isn't muted.
I'm sorry. Well,
yeah, I'm getting sounds from you over there. The
mic is off.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just keep on going. So I think the big difference is the utility of the neural prosthesis that you've got. So for example, in the case of a cochlear implant, you've got a patient who couldn't hear at all or can't hear much. And they're very happy if they can learn to use any tool, be it a crutch if you're trying to walk or a cochlear implant, to just get the function they're trying to get. They don't care a lot about whether it feels the same as it used to, if they were hearing the same as they did before they lost their hearing, if that's the case. Similarly with people who get a retinal implant and all that. So that's a little different than, for example, the case of a healthy patient who has a very well-working piece of brain tissue that does something, and who, first of all, wants the function to be just as good, who may not want to spend a year learning how to use it. But then also in some parts of the brain, if you're trying to build a replica of what's there, it's very important to capture exactly what's there. Because let's say there's a portion of your brain that remembers what your parents look like. You can't just put an arbitrary system in there that can remember faces, because that no longer remembers what your parents look like. Now, of course, you could go and learn what your parents look like again, but the idea is if you were going to use this as a process for eventually doing a whole brain emulation to, say, copy what's going on inside of your brain, what you've remembered, your experiences, you can't just toss them all away and put in, similar functional pieces. Now, of course, if you're trying to use what you learn about a piece of the brain to then build an artificial brain that doesn't need to be anyone in particular, that's a whole different ballgame. Then you could just build functional components like that, and it should work. And I'm sure that there are gray zones and areas where this is all, you need a little bit more of the underlying detail or a little bit less. And it probably depends on the part of the brain you're working with as well, because maybe for most people who need who would like to get a brain emulation at some point, even if it's for a whole mind uploading project, they might be totally happy with a less precise emulation of their cerebellum, as long as it still helps them carry out their motor functions and all that and the connection with the body. So this is really, in part, a question about what are the success criteria for mind uploading? What are the success criteria for whole brain emulation? What are the success criteria for partial brain emulation? What are the success criteria for neural prosthesis? And that's something that we have to iteratively figure out what those are and then aim for them depending on the project we're working in. So that would be my very long, unnecessarily long answer to that question.
We often think about developing emulations of parts of the brain or neuroplasticity in the context of getting the function of that system. If we're thinking in terms ultimately of using that model in the context of prosthesis, we're thinking about putting that model of that system into another system that's malfunctioning.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between part of the brain being missing and a part of the brain being present but generating the wrong signal.
Yeah.
So if we're going to interface a prosthesis or neural model with the existing brain, you have to think often about how to modify what's in the existing brain to make it correct. And that's very different from the way we usually think about developing the process.
Yeah. Nothing. Apparently I was on mute trying to say something that you couldn't hear before either. You couldn't hear what Ted Berger was saying, which was a very good comment on why you have to care about capturing some of the underlying coding even when you're building a neural prosthesis for a functional goal like helping someone who has a dysfunction. Because in many cases, like for example in the case of the hippocampal prosthesis, you have to put this device, this prosthetic device, back into a malfunctioning or partially functioning piece of the brain. It's not that that piece is necessarily entirely missing. First of all, that new device needs to be able to communicate and operate successfully with the remaining part of that piece of the brain and all of its surrounding neighboring parts that communicate with it. Now, yeah, so in that case, it's important that that these neural codes you're producing, that they're intelligible, that it makes sense in the context where you're trying to strengthen or trying to improve, trying to heal, trying to correct the coding that's going on. That is not always correct in the case of the patient's situation. I do remember that we've had several debates in the past about whether you could, despite that, force the patient's brain or the surrounding regions, the receiving area, to learn to use whatever codes, whatever strong codes you can create. So I think, again, even though that's true, there's probably some gray area and some debate about what's what's really usable. But that's a really good comment. Thank you. Okay, so any more in the house questions at this moment? Okay, I don't see any. Alicia, do you have any more there?
Yeah, someone asked if we could clarify OpenWater's claim to have achieved 1 billion times higher resolution than MRI. Can you speak to that?
Okay, so you're asking, can I speak to the claim by OpenWater to have achieved something like 1 million or 1 billion times better resolution than MRI?
I think if you take into account
Yeah.
going down from millimeters from centimeters, that's one order.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that billion will come from time.
Oh, okay.
So I think if you, because MRI is like 1 second, IR spectroscopy, which is.
Okay, so Daniel here had the answer for that. He's suggesting that where they get the number from is not just the spatial resolution, but it's a combination of the spatial resolution and then multiplied with the temporal improvement in the temporal resolution. If you're going down to or going up to a much higher temporal resolution than the MRI could achieve, that's where you get that big number from. Now I know how weird it is to wait for that live stream to catch up. Okay. Okay, I am not hearing anything from Alicia, so I'm assuming that there are no further questions from the
crap,
board.
I was muted.
Oh,
Sorry.
you were talking. Okay. Yeah,
I was talking.
All right.
Okay, so Keith posted a question. It's kind of a 3-part question, so I'll do one at a time. Ted said he successfully determined firing patterns associated with certain concepts. Did those patterns persist between subjects?
Oh, okay. So this is actually a question for Ted from Keith, who was saying, if I don't know if I'm getting it correctly because I don't see the question itself right here. Actually, I would like to see it, so I make sure I get it right. Oh yeah, here. Yeah, that's okay. I've got it. So Keith says, Ted said he had successfully or 50%, determined firing patterns associated with certain concepts, animals versus non-animals. Did those patterns persist between subjects? Was there a discovered universal representation of the animal category, or did it only categorize in the context of one subject? And gosh, I wish that Ted could just talk straight into the mic. Oh,
The answer is we haven't tested enough.
okay.
We don't have enough subjects.
All right, so Ted is saying the answer is we don't know yet because there haven't been enough subjects to figure that out.
Another month.
One more month, he says. Okay, Alicia, are you muted again, or?
Yes, sorry. We ready for the second part of the question, or did you get to all of it?
I think we got to all of it.
Okay.
And yeah, so
Well, I
maybe we
think
either
we're
move on, or
ready
if there's
for-
time, we could take a break in between if there's still time left.